Climate change is at the forefront of Davos this year. It seems to be millennials and a whole generation of people who care very much about this. But as a group, we aren't making huge progress.
Yeah.
How do you get people to shift those individual incentives for the greater good, for a better outcome?
I see a couple of mistakes happening systematically as a psychologist when I watch how people communicate about climate change. And I don't even think this is about incentives. It's often just about motivation and persuasion. So one mistake is it is a very abstract, seemingly far in the future cause. A lot of the communication is designed to change that, right? To say, we need to act in the next 8 years, or, we're going to have big problems in 12 years. That's still much further in the future than most people plan to make decisions. It's also hard to personify the effects of, okay, so we're going to have maybe rising temperatures and sea levels, and the whole planet's going to be affected. I'm not used to caring about a planet, right? It's too big, it's too abstract, and I also don't feel like my individual actions actually matter. And so I think we need to do a much better job humanizing the immediate effects of climate change. One of the best examples of this that I have ever seen was the Environmental Defense Fund. A few years ago, they sent out postcards with an image of polar bears on melting ice caps. And it just immediately tugs at your heartstrings, and you think, you know what, this is not okay, right? Somebody should do something about this. And then you start to feel like, well, maybe I could do something about this. And I think that, if you can get people to care about a polar bear, you can definitely get them to care about the human impact of climate change. And so I think we need some very immediate, very individualized, here are the consequences that you can affect now communication in order to move the needle a little bit.
People sometimes make the wrong decision for their best interests. And when it comes to voting, it sometimes seems like people do that as well. Have you thought at all about the dynamics of voting and how people make that decision?
Yeah, so this is way out of my expertise, right? So I'm a psychologist who studies work, and I don't think we become fundamentally different people at the voting booth. But I think, we certainly often consider different values and different aspects of our identity. So you should take everything I say with many grains of salt. But I actually think this whole idea of voting your interests or not is sort of a misnomer. Because when it comes to interests, people don't just think narrowly about what's good for them, right? They include in their interests their community, often their state, their country. And so one of the things I like to think about is what's often called the circle of moral regard. So, do you care about just yourself, your family, your friends, and then stretch it outward? And I think when people are accused of voting against their interests, what they're actually doing often is voting for a different part of that circle than what you might be thinking about. And so I don't know what to do with that necessarily, but I think it's something we should be more aware of, and we should allow people to be interested in things that do not immediately affect their economic well-being.
And we've talked before about how the people who are selected for management positions aren't necessarily the best managers, the qualities that make them chosen by executives. That seems like something that might also be true in political leaders. The characteristic that gets you there is not necessarily what makes you a good political leader.
Yeah.
Is that true? Is there any way for us to correct for that?
They're negatively correlated, right? So the more likely you are to get elected, the less likely you are to be effective. And that's, I think, in large part because the things that we admire from a distance are often really toxic up close. So if you look at research on narcissists, for example, if you watch a narcissist from afar, they're often perceived as very charismatic. You love the confidence, the bold vision that they bring to the table. If you have to work with that person, all of a sudden you realize, they constantly blame other people for their failures. They take credit for other people's successes. They don't listen well and learn well from other people. They tend to be overconfident in their own bets, which occasionally works out well and other times leads to disastrous decisions. And there's a whole body of research on how in teams, even when we're working with narcissists, we're more likely to elevate them into leadership roles and we're more likely to regret it afterward. And so, I think for me, the fundamental problem with elections is I think it's a popularity contest when it should actually be a competence and character contest. So the place that I would personally want to start if I had a chance to kind of reinvent this whole system is I'd say, you have to take a test in order to get a license to do most things that have real consequences. So if you want to fly a plane, right, you need a pilot's license. You even need a license to drive a car. You need to go to medical school and then take a test if you want to practice medicine. Same for practicing law. I think it's crazy that we don't have a test or a license to serve the public in office. And so my first thought was, well, why don't we have a civics test or a history test? where you are not eligible to run for office unless you demonstrate that you have some basic knowledge of what's gone on in your country, in your world, or even in your city. But then I wouldn't want to stop there. I also want to assess all kinds of abilities that leaders need. I want to know how well you make decisions. I'm interested in your forecasting skills. Can you predict the future? Can you resolve conflicts? And so, obviously the complexity of developing all these tests and deciding who should be the arbiters of them is something that I've not figured out yet. But I think it deserves some real attention. I would even say, let's just do a simple knowledge test. We'll allow you to phone a friend, multiple friends, and I want to know, can you assemble a group of people who actually have accurate knowledge? That seems like a useful thing to gauge in potential future leaders. I would even be willing to make it open book and say, the test is going to be too long, you can't use the book for every question. But, if you know where to find valid information, you can feel free to access that.
Is there a characteristic that can make that person succeed as a leader?
Believe it or not, there's such a thing as what's called humble narcissism. This is some really fascinating research launched by Brad Owens in the US, and then it's been extended to China recently. And the finding is that if you survey people about their CEO or about their manager, that they can identify very quickly whether that person tends to be narcissistic, right? So they tend to think they're better than others, they tend to have a sense of entitlement and grandiosity, and that can be a huge problem for the reasons we've talked about. But it's also possible to have some elements of humility along with that, right? Knowing that you have weaknesses as well as strengths, being motivated to overcome those weaknesses, maybe occasionally recognizing strengths in others and appreciating those. And so when you think about what it means to be a humble narcissist, that research says it's possible to couple the bold vision, the grandiosity, with a constant desire to improve and overcome your shortcomings. And if you can do that, that actually could make you a really effective leader. I think about Steve Jobs and his return to Apple, right? So early days Steve Jobs, I think just a plain narcissist, right? Or maybe an extreme narcissist, if you look at the typical signatures. If you look at his return, though, he gave a speech once where he said getting fired from his own company was awful tasting medicine, but the patient needed it. And I don't think he necessarily fundamentally changed as a person, but everyone I know who worked closely with him in both of those windows has said what you got was a more humble Steve Jobs, right? Somebody who knew he didn't have all the answers, who occasionally listened to other people, and that made him a more effective leader. But he still had that incredibly bold, dynamic vision. And I think there's value in that. There's also there's another type of narcissism that I think is kind of interesting. So there's a difference between what's often called agentic and communal narcissism. Terrible academic terms, right? So I wouldn't wish them on anyone. But the basic idea is agentic narcissists are people who define their success as being superior to others, whereas communal narcissists are people who often believe that they're special, but part of the way they define that is to want to make a real difference for others. And they end up being much less toxic than the agentic kind. I always think of the Silicon Valley episode where Gavin Belson says, I don't want to live in a world where someone else makes the world a better place better than I do. And that's a little bit of a flavor of communal narcissism, but if you have I think the common thread across humility and being communal or a little bit other oriented is if it's not all about you. If you have very high expectations and maybe even you're a little bit overconfident, but you care about other people, you listen to other people, you learn from them, that can channel some of your narcissistic traits in a more productive direction.
And let's talk about setbacks a little bit. How do you use that in a positive way so that it doesn't derail you?
There are a couple of good empirical answers to that question. The first one is you want to avoid the traps that Marty Seligman and his colleagues have written about when they study the psychology of our explanatory styles. So the question is, when something bad happens, how do you explain that to yourself and others? And what we find is that some people have a very pessimistic explanatory style that sort of shoots them in the foot, where they interpret bad events as completely personal, permanent, and pervasive. So they're often called the 3 Ps. So you say, look, this is my fault, this is going to ruin every aspect of my life, and it's always going to be horrible. And so the thinking styles that people are supposed to learn in order to become more resilient in those situations is to say, look, it's not always true, right? that those 3 Ps apply. And so it's worth asking, look, yeah, you want to take personal responsibility for your failures or your setbacks, but what other external circumstances contributed to those? And then what's the proof that maybe other parts of your life are unaffected by the job that you lost or by the failure you experienced at work? And especially, I think the permanence one is, to me, the biggest trap, because you'll catch people, you can actually see it in their language when they talk or when they write, they'll say things like, well, I will never be happy again, or I will always be a failure. Like, I'm sorry, can you predict the future? Do you have a crystal ball? I don't. It's an incredibly difficult task. And so what you're supposed to do then, according to this evidence, is you're supposed to edit your own language and say, right now, it feels like I will never be successful again.
A lot of your work is around how people make decisions, either with their best intentions or against them. And I've always wondered what guides your decision-making process.
So I think this is a great area where there's what's often called a knowing-doing gap, right? So as an organizational psychologist, I study these things daily. And yet I notice, this happens every year, I only teach in the fall. And one of the things I teach is this trap that's called escalation of commitment to a losing course of action. It's where you make an initial commitment. It might be an investment of money, it might be a project you take on, it might be a person you decide to collaborate with, and then it doesn't go as planned. So maybe you get negative feedback, maybe you fail, maybe it's just horribly frustrating. And then you have a choice. Are you going to cut your losses, or are you going to sort of double down? And what the data shows is that people often double down, right? So managers end up spending more money on failing projects and also struggling people than they do on their star performers and their really promising projects. They also end up over-investing time in the people who are not doing well as opposed to the people who are excelling. And so I talk about this every fall, and then as soon as I'm out of the classroom, I find myself falling victim to it. And I think there's a really challenging salience part of this. So I've learned from this is that I actually have to teach this stuff regularly in order to practice it. And what that means is when I'm not in the classroom, I need to do interviews like this. So I have an excuse to talk about these principles. But I find myself a lot going back to the research, but just writing a little bit about some of these principles. I find myself sort of deliberately talking through them in conversations that I have with people who are looking for advice, where normally I would just go right to the advice. Like, you know what? I need to be reminded of how difficult it is to de-escalate. So let's take a concrete example. One of the things I constantly do is I get overcommitted. And I end up thinking, wow, this project sounds really exciting, and then pretty soon I've way overextended myself. So I know that's an escalation situation. And as I'm talking about it, I realize, okay, one way to prevent myself from doing that is to set a rule, which is I will not ever say yes to a new project until I finish an old one. And as I have that rule handy, I'm a lot more likely to remember that and say, you know what, I would love to work on this. Right now, my plate feels very full. So, is it okay if we circle back in a couple months once I've finished what I'm currently working on? And then the reality is what I'm currently working on takes several months longer than I expected it to. And then I know once enough time has passed whether this is really a project that's going to sustain my interest or whether it was exciting in the moment and then not at all.
And one thing I'd like you to touch on a little bit that I've seen you post a little bit on is how you make a decision about your career. And it seems so attractive to be seduced by the power of a position or the title of a position, or like you talk about, like a book, like a final project, when what it actually takes to get there is maybe doesn't work with your style or what you actually want to do. Can you talk a little bit about how you get people to remind themselves of that?
Look, I think we're all affected by concerns about status and image, right? I think that I see this, though, all the time with my students, and I'll give you a few examples of where it jumps out at me. The first time I ever noticed it was, I was actually teaching my first class. I had a student come into office hours asking for advice about grad school. And I said, why are you considering to go to grad school? And the answer was, well, because I've always wanted to get my PhD. And I thought it was such a weird phrase to say my PhD. Like, one, you don't have one. Two, like, most people want to get a PhD. And it was very clear that this was kind of a centerpiece of her identity in this case, that having a PhD was an important way either to feel educated or to, I don't know, not disappoint her parents. And I came back and I said, yeah, there are lots of people who want to have accomplished something. The question is, what do you think about the process of working toward that goal? And what she realized really quickly was she loved consuming the results of research, but did not enjoy at all the process of producing it. And so it was pretty clear that a PhD program was probably not a great fit for her. And I've seen this over and over again since, right, where I have students who say, I want to go and work for an investment bank. And I say, okay, why? And they say, well, because these companies are very prestigious, and you get to work with a lot of very important people. I'm like, do you know what you'll be doing all day? Do you like Excel spreadsheets? Do you like working 90-hour weeks? Do you like not having say over who you work with and what you work on and what you get to learn? And I'm not telling anyone they should necessarily never work in finance, right? But what I want to get to is, do you actually enjoy thinking about markets? Do you like, trying to figure out a merger or an acquisition or an initial public offering? And if you find that kind of work interesting, it's probably a better job fit for you. And so I guess my takeaway here is to say that too often when we think about jobs, we think about, who the job will make us, right? The title we get to carry. And I just think it's a travesty that people are drawn to titles and positions that will impress other people, but then end up being depressed by those experiences. And so I think it's worth asking, how do I feel about the day-to-day work? Do I find it intrinsically interesting? Is it meaningful? Am I going to learn something from this set of maybe knowledge and skills that I'm exposed to? And I think, again, it's a knowing-doing gap, right? We could probably give that advice to others. The question is, how often do we take it for ourselves?
And that's hard to reframe it in that way.
I think it is. I mean, in my case, I called an advisor when I was finishing grad school, and I said, I know that there are certain places that it's hard to say no when Harvard calls. And I said, I want to make sure that I'm really evaluating the immediate people I'm going to be surrounded by and the teaching role that I have. So please remind me, do not go just because it's Harvard. I actually I turned down Harvard for my first job offer and went to UNC, because I felt that I was going to learn more from the people that I'd be collaborating with there. And it was an incredible learning experience. After 2 years, I ended up getting poached by Wharton, and one of my closest collaborators ended up going to Harvard.
Oh, wow.
So I don't know what that means, but it suggests that sometimes I don't practice what I preach.
One of the topics that I've been most obsessed with lately is happiness, and trying to figure out if that is the ultimate goal and what will actually make people happy, and if they're actually making decisions that will lead them to happiness. Is that what people are trying to achieve? How good are we at achieving it?
I think happiness is not always a good goal.
Okay.
John Stuart Mill actually wrote centuries ago that one of the only ways to achieve happiness is to have your mind fixed on some goal other than happiness. And there's actually some new research in psychology to back this up. So Iris Maus and her colleagues have done these interesting studies where they track how much you value happiness. So they would ask, how important is this to you? Is it a central life goal for you to be happy? And then they follow you and they survey you to find out how much joy and pleasure and satisfaction do you have in your life. It turns out that people who place extreme value on happiness are significantly less happy than people who just say, yeah, happiness is important, but it's not my most important objective. And then you could say, okay, well, maybe there's a reversal of causality there, and miserable people become obsessed with becoming happy. But then what they do is they run these experiments where they randomly assign people to try to pursue happiness, and they find that their happiness drops a little bit. So the question is why? When people start to think about becoming happy, they get too focused on their own internal states and say, well, how do I feel better? As opposed to saying, okay, what can I contribute to others? I think another piece of it is they get stuck in this mode where they're never experiencing. They're constantly evaluating, right? So I'm trying to be happy. Wait, am I happy right now? I don't know. Am I enjoying this conversation? Are you enjoying this conversation?
I think so.
Oh no, what if I could have been doing something more delightful? And then you start to experience this, this horrible fear of missing out. And being plagued by FOMO makes you really unhappy. Over time, then that turns into what I've started thinking about as ROMO, the regret of missing out, which happens after the FOMO. I love what Oliver Burkeman has called for as an alternative, which he calls JOMO, the joy of missing out. And he says every time you're thinking about all the great experiences you could have been having instead of the one you're currently having, you should instead think about all the unpleasant things that you're not doing and how thrilled you are that you got to avoid them. And I found that really helpful. But I think in the workplace, this is a mistake that people often make. Is I think I've watched a lot of people who maybe put too much emphasis on status and early career decisions, and then they realize, okay, I've got to really pay attention to what's important to me, and then they try to choose a job that makes them happy. And the problem is, I think that joy is often fleeting. So, the job that makes you happy today might be boring next year, right? Because it's become too easy. It might also become repetitive. It might be that your interests change. There's some research I've just read recently that's brand new, which shows that when people try to pursue passions, if they think about passion in terms of immediate joy or momentary happiness, they're less successful in pursuing that passion, less likely to find it even, than if instead they think about a passion as what's personally important to them. It's less about what you enjoy, it's more about what you value. And saying, can I find a job that brings me meaning? because the work that I do is going to allow me to become the person that I want to be and contribute to the world what I want to offer.